Okay, well, just as a way of sort of introducing myself a bit more so you have a better picture of who I am before I launch into the talk about Lars, let me just start us out with the place where Michael and I met at Pomona College. My college years were a very special time where I experienced God's love and presence and peace and freedom in a way that transformed me deeply, in a way that made me, in a maybe disconcerting way, start to care a little bit less about whether I got an A on my papers and more about whether the people around me knew how much God loved them. And people at my school used to say that I actually minored in philosophy and majored in the college Christian fellowship. And that became something that was where I really felt as though I was called to pour into. And what really stuck out to me about this college ministry was the community, the sense of shared life, the sense of sharing all things in common, whether our struggles over school or just the joys of a meal in the dining hall, brushing our teeth in the dorm bathrooms, all these different things that we shared led to a rich communal life. And then I went to seminary. And I think not because it was a Protestant seminary, but just because perhaps it was a seminary, an institution of graduate education. It was really tough. There were glimpses of community. There was a group of people who I became really close with who were part of something called the farminary, the seminary farm. And we worked on a farm together, and there was a sense of community there that was a little bit richer than what we got in the classroom. But nonetheless, at seminary, I felt like probably by virtue of having to write so many dense papers and not really having time to just be with people and see them and be known by them on a deep level, I felt as though I regressed into not so great ways of being and just felt as though I lost track of what it meant to really be human, to really be with people. And in seminary, I took a class on ministry with people with disabilities, and it was a class that really affected me on a deep level. And it was a class where I learned about Lars, and it was a class where I realized that perhaps my longing for deep community and my desire to have relationships with people with intellectual disabilities might actually need to come together. And so before I launch into talking about Lars, let me just say, well, let me ask first, who knows what I'm talking about when I say the word Lars? You can put your thumbs up if you know exactly what I'm talking about, you know all about it, you've read some books about it. In the middle, if you've just maybe heard about it a little bit, and down if you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'll just scroll through the gallery view here to get a sense. Okay, we've got a little bit, yeah, there's some of each. Okay, great. I think I've got a good sense now. Wonderful. So just before I say more about Lars, I just want to say that also I'm not a representative of Lars. Lars means the ark, and it refers to Noah's ark. And that captures how it exists to be a place of shelter for everyone, and also how different all of us are. All of us on this ark are very different. I've only been there for 10 months, and I'm speaking about my experience there, and only my experience. But with that said, there's some language in the Lars USA Charter that gives a good sense of what Lars is about. So let me just launch in with some of that. So the identity and mission of Lars. Our identity statement says, we are people with and without intellectual disabilities, sharing life in communities belonging to an international federation. Mutual relationships and trust in God are at the heart of our journey together. We celebrate the unique value of every person and recognize our need of one another. So L'Arche is, in large part, is basically a network of homes. So I'll only speak about my home for now, but L'Arche is a place, it's a home where people with intellectual disabilities are the core. They are the core family members. In a lot of places, they're called the core members, but actually one of the core members at L'Arche in DC said that that felt like an impersonal term. So he wanted to be called a core family member. So that term has stuck. So the core family members are the people with intellectual disabilities, and they're the core of the community. They're the people who live in the home for life. And assistant family members like myself, often younger folks, come into L'Arche to support the core family members in their routines for a year or two, sometimes longer, but often just a year or two. And the mission of these homes, as it's stated in the charter, is to make known the gifts of people who have intellectual disabilities, revealed through mutually transforming relationships. I like to actually rephrase that because I don't want to say that the goal of the homes is to just show that people with intellectual disabilities have something to offer. I like to say that the mission is to make known the gifts that people who have intellectual disabilities are. The people themselves are a great gift. And that is revealed through mutually transforming relationships. And I'll speak more about what I mean by mutually transforming relationships. I know that's kind of a mouthful. So one important thing to know about L'Arche is that L'Arche stands in this, in a space where it's trying to be a service provider that meets the needs of people with intellectual disabilities, while also being a lot more than a service provider, while also being a home and a community and a family. So as you may know, in the 60s and 70s, there were many institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. And it started to be recognized just how inhumane a lot of these institutions were, how little they actually gave space for people with intellectual disabilities to learn and grow. Often they were more like prisons that basically kept people with intellectual disabilities contained and needing as little care as possible. And L'Arche was actually born out of that sense that actually this is this way of treating people with intellectual disabilities is utterly unacceptable. And John Vanier, who I can talk about a little more, has been in the news recently. We can talk about him later. But he was part of founding L'Arche, and the reason why he founded it was because in communication with people with actually some of the intellectually disabled men in a community he visited, he realized that the institutions that were serving people with intellectual disabilities needed to be changed. And so Jean Vanier, upon visiting an institution and seeing 80 intellectually disabled men just walking around in a circle all day, taking a compulsory 2-hour nap, and then being expected to just live that sort of life, John Vanier asked 2 men to come and live with him and to found L'Arche with him. And they together founded this community, which just started as a home, and that home has then blossomed into many, many homes around the world. L'Arche is in that space of trying to provide a home and a space where services can be provided competently to people with intellectual disabilities. But it also recognizes that it's not the solution to the problem of how there are so many people with intellectual disabilities who are actually in need of services and not able to receive them. Jean Vanier says quite poignantly that Lars seeks to offer not a solution, but a sign that a society to be truly human must be founded on welcome and respect for the weak and the downtrodden. So although in the US, 500,000 people with intellectual disabilities are on waiting lists to receive home and community-based services, L'Arche is there as a place for people, and many people are part of L'Arche's database, where once an opening is there, people can apply to be part of L'Arche. But there's always a need for more of these homes for people, because they can be really oases for people who have who are often living with their aging caregivers who are no longer really able to care for them, usually their parents. So having known a little bit about L'Arche from my class in seminary, having read Henry Nouwen, who some of you may have heard of, and some of Jean Vanier, and seeing the ways that they were transformed by being in relationship with people with intellectual disabilities, I was intrigued, and I realized that in my calling to be a minister, I felt under-equipped to actually be a minister to people with intellectual disabilities. And even there, in the way that I phrased that, you can tell that there was a shift in the way that I saw people with intellectual disabilities. I'm going to be speaking more about ministry with rather than ministering to. And even there, I caught myself using ministry to. But that fits where I was before. So why L'Arche? Why did I end up at L'Arche? When I was being interviewed about L'Arche, I actually was shocked to discover that I wasn't really talking about wanting to be as much with people with intellectual disabilities. That was part of it, but part of what I longed for was for that community that I mentioned I had at Pomona College. I just longed for a community that moved slowly, a community that was okay with taking its time and recognizing that love takes time, and that the growth of community has to be slow. I think I had speed read so many books on theology and written so many papers on spiritual formation that I'd hardly had time to just be with people, as I mentioned. As I would see later, L'Arche is what it is. It is the slow, deep community that it is because of people with intellectual disabilities. And that's why it's remained what it is. The other reason that I ended up going to L'Arche was that I realized that although I wanted to believe deeply that people with intellectual disabilities were just as precious to God and just as much bearers of the image of God as any normal or neurotypical person, I knew I didn't feel that in my bones. I knew that my theology snuck people with intellectual disabilities in the back door rather than making them a focal part of the way that I thought about God and God's relationship with us. I knew the fact that Scandinavian countries boast of having eliminated people with Down syndrome from their population because of using a highly effective prenatal test. I knew that that was wrong. I knew that that was evil, and that this wasn't something to be celebrated. I knew that the language of saving people with Down syndrome from a life that would not be worth living was utterly warped. And I wanted to believe that people with intellectual disabilities are infinitely precious. But in practice, when I saw a person with an intellectual disability pass by me on the street, I didn't look at them the same way that I would look at anyone else. I looked at them differently, and I knew that there was something wrong with that. I knew that that did not please God. I have a hunch that despite what we hear at Mass, all but the most saintly of us perhaps believe that what makes a good human being is getting things done, independence, being generally a nice person, having it together, having social acumen, and being able to use words like acumen. And if that's how we see what it means to be human, or at least the way that deep down we believe, then you would see me being at Lars as a form of service. If we carry that mentality into Lars, where I work, you could see me supporting core family members by cooking, cleaning, helping them bathe, administering medication, accompanying them to doctor's appointments, doing things which the core family members often couldn't do without my support. And you probably see all of this as service. And when I tell people where I work, that I work at a place where people with intellectual disabilities are at the center, they often say, "Oh, that's so good of you," as if I'm really sacrificial in ministering to people with intellectual disabilities. But the truth is, they ministered to me far more than I could minister to them. Indeed, if we remember that the fundamental need that we have is to love and be loved by God and by other people, then it is truly the case that the core family members ministered to me so much more than I ministered to them. And to illustrate, I'm going to tell you a bit about two of the core family members, Bruce and Charles, and my relationship with them. Before I talk about them, I just want to, call out that perhaps there's people on this call who identify as having an intellectual disability or have family members with an intellectual disability. And I'm just sharing about two people that I've come to really love over the last 10 months. And one thing I think that bears repeating is if you've met one person with an intellectual disability, you've met one person with an intellectual disability. So with that in mind, let me just mention a little about Bruce and Charles. When I asked Bruce what he wanted me to say to y'all today, he said, "Say hello, shake their hands, and say welcome." That's it. And that sums up so much about Lars. The core family members are used to welcoming people into their home, into their routines, over and over again. The core family members are there for life, and they're welcoming. There's a revolving door of assistant family members who are coming in for a year, maybe two. And just imagine a different person bathing you every year. Someone new. You have to get used to someone new bathing you. You have to get used to someone new cooking meals for you or with you. You have to get used to someone helping you wipe up in the bathroom. And there's 4 or 5 assistant family members working at any one time. So every day there's someone new. And then there's turnover of all of that crew of assistant family members within a year or two. So there's constant turnover, and it's very difficult. But the core family members, it's hard to say if they've just been gifted in doing this from the beginning or if it's something they've learned over the years, but they're so welcoming. They make you feel as if you've been there for forever, just from the beginning. It takes time, but they're just very welcoming. So let me talk specifically about Bruce and Charles, because Lars is really about relationship more than anything. And I can't sum up relationship, but I'm going to try. Just there's like little vignettes. So just let me start with a little thing about Bruce. So Bruce is one of the most tender, gentle, flexible, amiable guys you could ever imagine. He's about 5 feet tall, French guy, just very sweet, just wants everyone to be happy. He's a peacemaker. But one of the most unique things about Bruce is the way that he looks at his own limitations. So when Bruce tries to thread his belt through the loops on his pants, Bruce doesn't have a lot of dexterity, and so often he can't get it through the loops. But when he can't get it through the loops, he finds it hilarious. He recognizes that there's like a disconnect between what he wants to do and what his body is actually in fact able to do, but he finds it funny. Whereas I would find it deeply frustrating. When Bruce feels as though he's going to lose his balance, he's not worried. He looks at us, he sees how much we're freaking out and trying to catch him, and then he laughs. When Bruce drops a Lego, he loves playing Legos, it falls on the floor, he's like, darn it, here we go again. In just this sort of happy-spirited way. And then Bruce will try picking up the Lego as many times as it takes without often being able to get it, without losing his mind. Instead, eventually, if he can't get it, he'll say, Danny, come get this piece for me, I can't do it. But there's this sort of contentment about him. Bruce will be doing a physical therapy exercise, and sometimes he wants his shoulder to go back, but instead it goes up. And again, he just laughs. He just laughs. Oh, my body's not doing what I want it to do. Isn't that funny? And it's as though, although Bruce would never articulate it this way, it's as though Bruce is saying, this is who I am. I'm happy with it. Even my limitations give me something to laugh at. It takes me as long as it takes me to tie my shoes. I don't compare myself to others. I just live my life, and it is good. Now, Charles, very different from Bruce. Charles and Bruce are an illustration of the fact that if you've met one person with an intellectual disability, you've met one person with an intellectual disability. Charles is a 6-foot-something, robust, kind of machismo type of guy who is very opinionated and just to the point, a fighter for justice, really cares. And also, it's very different from Bruce. So when Charles is trying to get his shirt on, often it gets stuck. And sometimes I come around and I'm about to help Charles, and I see that his shirt has become his enemy. He is getting really mad, and he's about to rip off his shirt. That's one thing. Charles, similarly, if he makes a mess in the bathroom, he says, "Oh, I can't help it. I've got an intellectual disability." And you can tell that he feels almost ashamed that he needs support. Charles also, when someone is sharing about a gift that they have around the dinner table, Charles will chime in and say, I can do that too. And I can do X and Y and Z. And it's as though Charles is saying, I'm good. I have something to offer too. It's as though Charles might not say it this way, but it's as though Charles is saying that he's always longing for more. If only I could be fully independent. If only I could move at the speed I want to move. If only people would listen to me more and take me more seriously. And you can tell here in the contrast between Charles and Bruce, and I'm not lifting up Bruce over Charles. Bruce and Charles both have amazing gifts, and this is just one sort of contrast between them. But you can see here how Bruce was deeply cared for by two loving parents who did all that they could to carve out a space for him in every space that they occupied as a family. Charles was often spoken to very poorly by a lot of people who were close to him, and he was isolated from the world a lot before he got to Lars. And since coming to Lars, he's had freedom, he's been valued in a way that he wasn't valued before, and he loves it. He wants more of it. And so we can see here the ways that we are loved and the ways that we are wounded often end up informing the ways that we respond to others, the ways that we are either going to lash out or the ways that we're going to be content and just trust that that all is going to be well. And so I learn from Charles what it feels like not to be loved, what it feels like not to be cared for, and what it tastes like to have that freedom. And I learned from Bruce as well what it's like to to live out of a sense of contentment and to have had your needs met. And I find both of them so enriching, and they minister to me. Let me just point out another contrast between Bruce and Charles as well that's been really meaningful to me. Bruce, oh man, I just can't help but smile big when I'm thinking about Bruce and Charles. When I'm helping Bruce fold his laundry and someone calls for help, Bruce will say, "Oh, go help Lori. I'll be okay. I can wait. She needs your help." When I ask Bruce, "What kind of snack do you want?" Bruce will say, "Any kind." That's something my wife and I have started to say to each other when we don't know what we want. Any kind. It's just become part of our lingo as well. Last year when we were trying to go to a Thanksgiving party, we were inviting Bruce, and Bruce was saying, "No, I'm tired. I don't really want to go." But Simone really loves Bruce, and Simone was saying, "Bruce, why don't you come with us?" And she kept kind of niggling at him, and eventually he was like, "Okay, I want to make you happy." And he came to this party he had no interest in going to. Similarly, when we want to go on a walk with Bruce, it's good for us to get out in the fresh air during COVID, right? And so we'll be asking Bruce, "Do you want to go on a walk, Bruce?" And Bruce, "No, I don't." But Bruce can tell that we really want to get out of the house, that we, the assistant family members, have cabin fever. And Bruce will say, "Okay, yeah, sure, let's go on a walk." And we know that he's doing it for us. It's as if Bruce's life exclaims, "Why do you worry? Consider the lilies." There's no sense in getting worked up. I can trust people to look out for me, to remember me, to love me, to want me, to value me. And that's something that I need to be reminded of all the time. Now, Charles, when I'm supporting Charles with something like cleaning up in the bathroom or something, Charles will say, "They can wait. This is important," not wanting me to leave him for later. If people are laughing and having a good time just around the corner and Charles is reading the newspaper, he'll start making noise and heckling people because he feels excluded, and he doesn't want people to be having such a good time that they forget about him. Just today, I asked Charles if he wanted a veggie burger. Charles said, "No, I've told you before I don't like those. Don't ask me again. I'm mad at you." When we saw fire trucks close to Charles's day program, he said to me, "You would come get me if there was a fire, right? Even if you weren't on the clock?" It's as if Charles's life often says to me, "Do you love me?" And he says that in ways that are as persistent as Jesus asking Peter, and it sometimes hurts. You're like, "Of course I love you, Charles. You know that." But Charles will ask you with his life, "Am I worthy of your love? You say you love me, but do you like me? Am I good enough? Am I wanted?" And Charles, in this case, teaches me so much. He teaches me that he's helped me realize that since coming to Lars, this slow-moving community that I so desire to be a part of and to be rehabilitated by, there's actually been other assistant family members who are more efficient and competent and better at remembering the things that need to be done. And I find myself wondering, am I worthy? Am I good enough for this place? Am I a competent service provider? Similarly, he's helped me realize that my wife is much more high achieving than me, and let's just say her gifts are much more valued by our economy. And I find myself wondering sometimes with Charles, am I valuable? Am I wanted? Am I any good? And in this way, Charles reminds me of what is true. He reminds me in those moments, he reminds me that I am meaningful to him. He's one of the most empathetic, boldly forgiving, fierce advocates for justice and rest. He'll tell me, Danny, you need to go rest. Forget about this, go rest. So Charles, in his vulnerability, reminds me that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay that in a space of trust, being vulnerable gives us the opportunity to care for one another and to meet each other where we are. And our vulnerabilities don't pose a liability to us in our pursuit of God. They open us up to experiencing God's nearness. And that's been some of the, Charles and Bruce have both just shaped me in all these different ways and teased different things out of me that I would have never imagined coming out of me. I really want to leave time for Q&A, and let me just close by saying that I haven't gotten to talk about the individuals at Lars as much as I would have liked, but part of the reason is that I could never do one of them justice by describing them, right? I've only given little vignettes. And my challenge to you is, if you don't have people with intellectual disabilities in your life, if they're not in some way close to the core of your life, seek them out. And I can tell you that there's no excuse to not do this. I know COVID-19 makes it hard, but there's a Lars Portland, and actually Lars Portland is the headquarters, like the big kahuna is in Portland. So there's 4 homes that are homes of hospitality that are going to welcome you in when COVID-19 cools down. And you just email them and say, hey, can I come over for dinner? And you have dinner with people, and all of a sudden you're one of their friends and they want to see you again, and you become part of that community. And it's special. So people with intellectual disabilities are all different, and yet they will help you see the world in a different way. And I for all of your sakes, I desire that you would get to know people with intellectual disabilities on a deep level. And with that, I will see if maybe we have time for some questions. Michael?
Okay, Dan, here's what we're gonna do. We're I think we've received some feedback that people would like to ask questions. Though normally this would be our breakout time. And so Abby, I'm kind of alerting you to this now. What we're gonna do instead is go to a Q&A format, and we're gonna nix the breakout rooms. So we can have plenty of time to take it slow, as you might like, Danny, and just go through some some questions. So the way we can do the questions, since we have enough people that this is possible, and I think it would be nice to hear people's voices, you can either, if you want, you can send me a question and I can just repeat it to Danny, or you can just type in that you have a question, and then I can call on you. So you can have a kind of more direct interaction. I think Danny would benefit from that too, to hear some of our voices. So actually the first person, we'll try this out to start, is Thad. So he sent me a question privately. If you would like to, and then I have some questions too, but we're gonna get to anybody who wants one first. I'll just go if there's leftover room. So Thad, if you wanna unmute yourself and ask your question, let's try it that way.
Yeah, Danny, I had a question. If you develop this phenomenal relationship with a person over 1 to 2 years, and then you move on from the family, what's the impact on the individual that is obviously staying at the house? I mean, is there a sense of loss? I mean, in my head, I'm kind of thinking like, you know, the kid, the single mom, and you know, the guy comes in, the suitor comes in, he's there for a while and he leaves, and the kid is like, what the heck, you know, where's my father figure? Is it something like that? Or, and if it is, what do you guys do to try to mitigate that?
Yeah, that's Thank you, Thad. That's a really important thing to bring up. It is hard for the core family members. I'll just say that up front. You know, there are times where the core family members are just thinking about someone who's moved on, you know, who's across the country. And thankfully, you know, we can video chat and all of that, but it's still not the same, you know. One thing we try to do to mitigate it is we try to have it be the case that not everyone is, not all the assistant family members are leaving at the same time. So we try to stagger things so that there's a sense of consistency, that at least one person or two of the assistant family members are still there when someone else leaves, because if everyone left, it would just be completely disorienting. And there's actually different leadership structures that help with this. So there's a home life leader in the community who is committed to being there for longer. So there's a leadership, there's a person in the home who's sort of committed to being there for a longer amount of time. And there's also higher up leadership who don't necessarily live in the home, but are there all the time. So there's people there who've been there for 9 years plus, who are maybe who are more coordinators of services and things, but people who are coming into the home, you know, people who are having dinner all the time, people who are there every Tuesday when we have a prayer night. So there is some consistency, and there are some assistant family members who stay longer than 1 or 2 years who end up becoming those leaders. But there's also this sense that that people with intellectual, that the core family members know that the way that things often work is that people are going to have to move on, and that there is this sense that we're sending people who have now been changed, and we know that they're never going to be the same, and we send them out knowing that they will take Lars with them in a way. But I don't want to, you know, belittle the point, because it is a very important point, and it's something that's not perfect about Lars. But I will say that in other settings, the people with intellectual disabilities end up being much more guests in a service provider space, and that actually can also be more detrimental, I think, than people being in their home and having people come in and join in on their routines. So there is something about the Lars model, but it doesn't completely mitigate the sense that there's loss when the assistant family members leave. Yeah, thank you, Thad.
Thanks. Okay, Robert, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, if you want to add to that, I'm not sure. Robert Hughes.
There we go.
Actually, it was me, and I was just wondering, it sounds like you actually live in the homes during this period, or do you stay for part of the week?
Yeah, so I actually lived in the home for about 7 months before I got married. I got married during COVID on Zoom, a lot like this. And I had maybe like a little bit naively wanted to live in the home with my wife. That's something that it turns out has been tried before at Lars in the DC area and has never gone well, to be living as a newlywed couple in a Lars home. So actually that wasn't even an option that they presented me. I was like, what do you guys think about this? They're like, nope, you got to move out. And I was like, okay. So I now live just 5 minutes drive from the home. And it's definitely changed the dynamic. Like it was different to be able to just roll out of bed and to share a bathroom, you know, with some of the core family members. So there's been loss for me in that, and loss for them. But it's also something where the core family members are so happy for me, and they see Simone as part of the community, my wife Simone, as part of the community. And, you know, it's different now with COVID. She can't just come over, but but yeah, now I'm just 5 minutes away. But living in the home is really special. That's, I think, where so much of the mundane day-to-day things that make community rich happen. So I do miss that.
All right, Danny, I have a question for you. And like I said, anyone, if you want to join in, you can just type in that you have a question, or if you're really brave in some dead space, you can start talking. So Danny, what I was kind of wondering, I guess, bigger picture from that movement that you described, from longing for this new space in your life, a new kind of relationship with other people and with God. So obviously when you're coming in from there, you have a set of expectations. And in many ways, those expectations are fulfilled or met, or go as you would think. What are some of the kind of the primary ways in which you found yourself in emotional spaces, or intellectual spaces, relational spaces that you didn't anticipate being in? What is, in other words, have been the surprises of this endeavor?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Mikey. Something that I should have expected, which I was warned about, was that the relationships with the core family members are actually usually the easy relationships. The relationships with your fellow assistant family members are the ones that are hard, because people have a different mentality towards the job, or a different sense of how things should be done, or the best way to systematize, cleaning the home and all these different things. And this is something that the core family members often lead us in. They help us to figure out how things should be done in the home. But the assistant family members, also have their say. And so there have been times where I was just shocked by how difficult it's been to work things out with certain assistant family members who just, I feel like there's only one way that they will allow things to be done. And I just wonder, I'm like, why can't we do it another way? So that's one of the big things. I would say another difficulty. I'd say another difficulty would be having to really negotiate what it means to give someone as much agency as you can, and how that actually grates sometimes against supporting someone with doing what's better for them. So there's something in Lars that we talk about, using the term dignity of risk. So if someone's doctor has told them they really need to not eat sweets, and they need to actually eat all these things that they don't want to eat. There's people with intellectual disabilities, I'll talk about Charles. Charles and I have a good relationship, and we often are, I'm often trying to be like, hey, Charles, do you want to have this healthy food? And Charles no, I want pancakes and eggs and jam and bread, and so often I know that Charles has places an inordinate level of stress on the importance of authority. So if I really harp on, your doctor said this, your doctor said, Charles, that this would be better for you, Charles will eventually relent, and he will do the healthy thing. But there's been times in those cases where I felt like I have taken Charles's agency away, that I've used my power, knowing the ways that Charles responds to authority, to basically strong arm him into doing something he didn't want to do. And so knowing that in so many cases, people with intellectual disabilities have had their agency restricted, have been told, you need to follow this institution's routines. You get to wake up when we say you can, and eat what we say you can, what everyone else is eating. There's this desire to really give these folks agency. And yet there's also this sense of wanting to support them in making healthy decisions. And so I wasn't expecting that tension where where I'm not sure whether I should support Charles with eating healthy, because I know that he really doesn't want to, and I want him to be able to feel like the first thing that he thinks can be a good thing. It doesn't have to be the fifth thing after I've convinced him that's what he should do. So that's been a big one for me. Are there more specific things you were thinking of, Michael, that I might be going a little bit astray?
No, I kind of asked it as a big general question, so that's
Yeah.
good. Yeah, kind of taking it in terms of challenges. I guess that's what always surprises you in living with anybody, is the kind of specific thorny nature of interpersonal challenges. And
Yeah, I would just also say that the other thing that surprised me is that if you read spiritual writers like Henry Nouwen, you can often think that living with people with intellectual disabilities is just going to be like a constant epiphany, where like they're just going to blow your mind all the time, and like you're going to have a completely different outlook towards life. But like in the day-to-day, like they're just people, you know. They're people who have needs, who have desires, who have weaknesses, who have wounds, you know, and they just show you your own humanness in a lot of ways, and remind you that we're just people. Like so often people with intellectual disabilities are painted as either saintly and innocent lambs, or as people who are somehow not as human or valuable. Both of these are equally horrible. And just living with people with intellectual disabilities has made it so clear to me that these are just people. They will sometimes blow your mind, just like a lot of people blow your mind. And they do have a unique perspective. But all of us also have a unique perspective in a way, if we're willing to hear it. So yeah, just the fact that they are just, you know, that they're people like anyone else has been something that shouldn't have been surprising, but in a way has been.
it was, yeah. Okay, so Margaret has a question for you, Danny.
Sure.
So one of the nurses in the audience, as you talk about the healthy choices for eating and the agency, so I'm curious where do you function in a healthcare proxy role where you're partners for their good health as well? Understanding you want to support their agency, but you know, diabetic, obesity, you know, all the things that are risk for diseases. I'm just curious where your partnership is for healthy behaviors.
Sure, yeah. So my role is technically a direct support professional. So I wouldn't say that I'm by any means a medical proxy. I do support the core family members in going to medical appointments, and you know, I support with helping to administer meds on a day-to-day basis. But we have nurses who are part of Lars, who are friends of the community, who we're in pretty constant communication with whenever there's an issue that arises. But otherwise, we're also on the phone with the core family members' doctors often, and going to appointments and contacting the pharmacy and making sure that the doctor's orders have been faxed to the pharmacy. But that's kind of the extent of our role, you know. Yeah. Feel free to follow up if I'm
No,
not.
you just got busted. You just got busted by a nurse, you know, that you're not following the diet recommendations.
I know.
Oh,
Like,
man. Thanks.
We try.
Okay, Danny, I'm gonna ask the hard question. I'm gonna ask it now because we can't let it be the last one. I know for some people who know Lars, obviously they're aware of the scandal with Jean Vanier. Essentially, he was using his, if you want to reformulate what I'm saying, essentially he was using his position to make sexual advances And this came out after his death. And especially given the fact that Lars has such an aura of purity and sanctity, and beauty to it and simplicity, I think this shocked a lot of people, and certainly sent a shockwave through the Lars community. There were people who were ready to kind of nominate him for sainthood, and it's been tough for a lot of people to try to digest. So I would ask you not to offer some kind of apologetic for what happened, because I think there are a lot of good directions to go in recognizing the fact that all of us are flawed, or finding ways in which people can remain kind of aware of the mission of Lars and all the beauty in the household that doesn't change a lick because of what happened. But could you just comment on kind of the reaction of the people in the home, anything in particular of how people see that or have dealt with it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely been something hard for people in different ways. You know, the people in the home who have experienced sexual abuse were especially affected. You know, this person who they revered, this person who is a spiritual figurehead, a sort of light on the horizon, if nothing else, to them was in a way snuffed out. It was very difficult. I'll say one of the folks in the home, Charles, who I spoke about, said outright, he lost my trust. And Charles he's been pretty broken up about it, you know. Lori, a woman in the home, just went, goodbye to that guy. This place has changed my life, and that guy doesn't mean anything to me. So there's a sort of weird relationship in a way with John Vanier, because he was, I would say, in a lot of ways, a light on the horizon, not so much, you know, a candle that was just right here. Because L'Arche, although it is an international federation, L'Arche in France doesn't have as immediate of a relationship with, say, L'Arche USA. You know, an international meeting of L'Arche happens very rarely. I'm not even sure when the last one was exactly. And so there is this sense that this person who we all looked up to, we kind of have a complicated relationship with now, and we don't know what to do with that. But there is also a sense that our home is still intact, and there's a deep sense of trust within the home that hasn't been broken. And for that, I'm really thankful. You know, I was expecting people with intellectual disability, the core family members, I'm sorry, to perhaps be like, how can we trust any of you? You know, but there wasn't that sense. There is sort of this sense that we know you, Danny, and we know you, Hannah. You know, we know you, assistant family members, and you are not connected with that guy. You're not connected with John Vanier. You are your own people, and we trust you. And that just means the world to us, you know. So it's hard to capture the gravity of that revelation that we all saw in the news, but thankfully the trust still remains.
Thank you, Danny. So Kevin and Shelley have a question, or one of the two of them.
Hi. So thank you, first of all, for talking to us tonight. It's been really wonderful. So my question for you is, as you're experiencing the day-to-day life with Charles and Bruce, and thinking about the way that as a society we tend to look at people with intellectual disabilities and have not necessarily, especially when you talked about in the 60s and 70s when people were put into facilities and mistreated. Based on your experiences now, do you have a better idea of what are some things that we could do and implement into our society, into our systems, that would be more would be sustainable to help people on a bigger scale?
Yeah, so one very basic thing is that so we're probably not going to just be able to multiply large homes, as I said, but at the same time, there is, so Medicaid funds used to only go towards funding institutions, right? And so people with intellectual disabilities who had support and care needs would be able to would basically have their care funded by Medicaid. Now there's what's called these Medicaid Waiver, the Medicaid Waiver program, which allows Medicaid funds to go towards having direct support professionals either come into the home of the person with an intellectual disability, or for a sort of group home setting, like Lars, but some places are actually a bit bigger and feel a little bit more like a facility, but there's many laws that have been put into place to protect people's rights and dignity. Lots of training that's now mandatory in light of all these institutions being exposed for what they were. And so one of the big things that actually Charles goes to the Capitol, we're here in DC, and advocates for is for more Medicaid waivers, and for actually more access to in-home care. And this is something that I think basically there needs to be more investment in these sort of homes for people. That's one of the biggest things. One of the problems is that actually going back to Thad's point, that there's a lot of turnover in direct support professional care. So there's a lot of vacancies where people aren't actually willing to do this work. And that's for a variety of reasons. It can be very difficult, and also doesn't always pay very well. Usually doesn't pay very well. And so having more people who are willing to be direct support professionals is one thing. But yeah, other than that, we definitely do need more facilities and better distribution of the resources. So in DC, there actually isn't currently, as far as I know, a very long wait list for people to receive home and community-based care. In Texas, a couple of years ago, there was 218,000 people on the waiting list. So the fact that, based on which state you happen to live in, you may be on a impossibly long waiting list, says that there's an imbalance of where the resources are being distributed to provide this sort of care. And that I don't have a solution for. And I'm still working on learning with Charles and with some of the leadership at Lars who are doing more of the on-the-ground advocacy work, what exactly it is that we need, what's the next step. But that's kind of like the beginning of an answer. But that's something that I can probably direct. I can do a little more research, to be honest, after this, and perhaps Michael could send on an article there, because I can't say that I have like a very robust sense, but I know where the resources are. But thank you. It's a really important question.
All right, Danny. Well, I think we're close to wrapping up and moving on to the Margaret moment, unless, let's see, did I just see somebody? Okay. Lau asks, if there are any specific scriptures that strengthen you in this ministry.
Man, that is a good question. I mean, the ones that immediately come to mind are the Beatitudes. Something that's a scripture that has been important to me for a long time, and that I've seen in a new light since coming to Lars. And the other one that comes to mind is the section in 1 Corinthians that talks about the foolishness of God being wiser than human wisdom. There's been a lot at Lars where I recognize that what seems wise is actually quite foolish, and where what seems foolish is actually God's wisdom. So one thing I was talking with Michael about before this talk was actually how the other day I realized that when I'm talking to Charles often, Charles often will say that something didn't happen, that he didn't say that thing that I said that he'd said a few minutes ago. And if I insist, because it actually did happen, that Charles said this thing, it will escalate, and Charles will insist that he has not said it, and that I am unjustly accusing him of this thing he didn't do. And for me, in that case, what seems wise is to insist on truth, to insist, no, you did say that. In fact, there's almost this desire to like record and then play it back and be like, gotcha, see? But actually in practice, me just swallowing my pride and moving on and helping us talk about something else more productive is usually what's wise in that case, you know? And it seems maybe counterintuitive and even uncomfortable to say that truth doesn't matter in that case. But sometimes I think that the wise thing is to recognize when our pride is masquerading as truth. And so that's one thing that's been really important to me. Yeah, so that's my hot takes, but yeah, I should have more scriptures just at the ready, but I don't.
Well, thank you, Danny.